The flight attendant's voice cracked through the cabin like a slap. "Sir, you need to stand up. Now." Every head in first class turned at once, the sound of leather shifting, a glass rattling in its holder. The low hum of the plane paused at the gate engines, silent, but tension loud enough to feel in the bones. James Carter didn't move. He sat in seat 2. A shoulders squared, hands resting flat on his thighs, eyes lifted slowly toward the woman blocking the aisle. The overhead lights caught the faint lines at the corners of his eyes. Not weakness. Years. Outside the window, rain streaked across the glass, blurring the tail of the aircraft into a grey smear. Inside, time felt pinned. "You're refusing a direct instruction from cabin crew," the attendant said. Again, louder now. Her name tag read Linda Peterson. Her jaw was set tight, lips pressed thin, the kind of expression learned over decades of enforcing rules without question. "You need to vacate this seat immediately." James inhaled through his nose. Slow, controlled, the smell of recycled air, faint coffee, synthetic leather. His pulse stayed even. He had felt this moment coming since he stepped onto the jet bridge. From the moment the boarding agent paused half a second too long when scanning his pass. From the look that flickered and vanished. From the way the man in the navy blazer behind him sighed before he even sat down. Across the aisle, Edward Miller leaned forward, elbows on his knees, impatience radiating off him. Early 50s, expensive haircut, wedding ring polished smooth by years of habit. He glanced at his watch again, then at Linda. "We're burning daylight here," Edward said, not raising his voice, but making sure it carried. "Some of us have connections." James felt the words land around him, not on him. He kept his gaze on Linda. Her eyes were sharp, assessing, already convinced of something she had not said out loud. "I'm in my assigned seat," James said. His voice was calm. Too calm for the moment. "You're welcome to verify it." Linda's nostrils flared. She did not take the boarding pass James offered. She looked past it, as if paper could lie more easily than people. "This seat is reserved for priority passengers," she said. "There appears to be a discrepancy." A murmur rippled through the cabin. Someone behind James shifted phone lifting, just slightly screen dark, but ready. A man 2 rows up cleared his throat and looked away. James lowered his hand, folding the boarding pass once then again precise. The sound of the paper was louder than it should have been. "A discrepancy," he repeated. "Is that what you're calling it?" Linda straightened. Her posture changed. Authority locked in. "So this conversation is over. Please stand." James didn't stand. From the galley, a cart clinked softly as another attendant paused, mid-step eyes darting between Linda and the seated man who refused to shrink. James could feel it now, the shape of the room closing around him. Not violently, procedurally. The way institutions move when they decide someone is out of place. He had seen it in boardrooms and courtrooms, in hospitals, in banks, different uniforms, same instinct. Edward exhaled sharply. "This isn't coach," he muttered loud enough. "Rules exist for a reason." James turned his head then, slowly. Their eyes met. Edward looked away first. Linda touched the radio clipped to her collar. Her thumb hovered, then pressed. "Gate supervisor requested at first class," she said. "Voice clipped. Immediate." The click of the radio echoed like a gavel. James leaned back slightly. The seat creaked under his weight. He stared at the ceiling for a moment, tracing the seams, the hidden cameras tucked into their quiet corners. He wondered which ones still worked, which ones were monitored, which ones recorded and were never checked unless something went wrong. He had asked those questions before, in different contexts. Different buildings, always the same answer. Not unless someone important complains. From the corner of his vision, he saw the woman across the aisle clutch her purse tighter. Fear, no. Discomfort. The kind that comes from proximity to conflict you don't want to own. James thought of his father's hands, folded the same way on his lap decades earlier, sitting in a waiting room that never called his name. Thought of how stillness could be mistaken for surrender by people who had never needed it as armor. Footsteps approached. He knew the rhythm before he saw the man. Thomas Reynolds stopped at the edge of the cabin. 61. Grey at the temples. Tie loosened just enough to signal authority without warmth. He took in the scene in a single glance. Linda, the seated passenger, the watching crowd, the ticking clock in his head. "What's the issue?" Thomas asked, already bracing for the answer. Linda spoke quickly. Too quickly. Passenger refuses to vacate a priority seat. "Credentials are questionable. We're delayed." Thomas nodded once. The delay word landed. His eyes flicked to the aisle clock, then to Edward Miller, who gave a tight smile of agreement. Thomas turned to James. "Sir, let's resolve this without escalating." James looked at him fully now, studied the man's face, the faint tension in his jaw, the calculation behind his eyes. This was not malice. This was efficiency. That was worse. "I'd like you to verify my boarding status," James said. "That's all." Thomas hesitated. A beat. 2. The cabin held its breath. "We can handle that off the aircraft," Thomas said, finally. "For now I need you to step out so we can depart." There it was. The familiar pivot. Order first. Truth later. Maybe. James felt something tighten in his chest. Not fear. Recognition. "If I step out," he said quietly, "this becomes something else." Thomas's lips pressed together. "Sir." James leaned forward, elbows on his knees, now voice low. "You're about to make a decision that follows you longer than this flight." A flicker crossed Thomas's face. Annoyance, doubt. He glanced at Linda, at Edward, at the watching phones. Then he straightened. "Security," he said into his radio. "We need assistance." The word assistance hung heavy. A collective exhale moved through the cabin. Relief for some, anticipation for others. James sat back again. His heart rate ticked up just slightly. He welcomed it. This was the threshold. Past it, systems revealed themselves. He felt the eyes on him. The judgments already written. The assumptions sealed. Let them. He adjusted his jacket, smoothing the fabric over his chest. A habit from long meetings, long days, long waits. Somewhere beyond the cockpit door, a decision had already been logged. A note entered. A box checked. James closed his eyes for half a second. This was not about a seat. It never was, and when the uniformed footsteps finally reached the aisle, echoing louder than they should have, James opened his eyes with a calm that unsettled everyone watching, because he knew something they did not. This was only the beginning. The first security officer stopped at the edge of the aisle and hesitated just long enough for the pause to be noticed. His hand rested near his belt, not on it, eyes moving from Linda to Thomas, then finally to James, who met his gaze without challenge and without apology. So the officer said, voice trained to sound neutral, "We need you to come with us." James remained seated. He did not argue. He did not resist. He simply looked past the officer toward the front of the cabin, as if measuring the distance between decision and consequence. "Before I stand," James said, "I want it noted that I have complied with every request to verify my seat and was denied that opportunity. Thomas stiffened. "That's not necessary." "It is," James replied. His tone was still even, but something underneath it had sharpened. "You're creating a record right now, whether you intend to or not." The officer shifted his weight. He looked back at his partner, a younger woman with her hair, pulled tight eyes, alert. She gave a slight nod. They had both heard this before, usually from lawyers or people pretending to be ones. Linda crossed her arms. "He's stalling," she said. "We need him off so we can push back." Edward Miller scoffed softly from his seat. "Unbelievable," he muttered. "All this over a seat." James turned his head just enough to see Edward clearly. Edward was no longer hiding his irritation. He leaned back, now confident, already rehearsing how he would describe this delay later. James wondered briefly what Edward told himself when things like this happened. That it was unfortunate, necessary, someone else's fault. James rose slowly. The leather seat sighed as he stood. The officer stepped back half a pace, surprised by the ease of it. There was no struggle to contain, no drama to justify. "I'll walk," James said. A ripple of movement passed through the cabin, phones lifted higher now, no longer pretending. A woman near the window whispered something James couldn't hear. The younger attendant by the galley pressed her lips together, eyes fixed on the floor. As James stepped into the aisle, Linda moved aside with crisp efficiency. She did not look at him. Thomas gestured toward the front. "Let's keep this calm," Thomas said, as if calm had ever been the issue. They walked forward together. James felt the subtle pressure of the officers flanking him, not touching, but close enough to guide the narrative. The narrow aisle amplified every sound, shoes against carpet, the low murmur of voices, someone clearing their throat too loudly. At the front, the cockpit door remained closed. The galley lights hummed. The smell of reheated food hung faintly in the air. The female officer spoke quietly now. "Sir, once we're outside, we'll need you to provide identification." James nodded. "That won't be a problem." Thomas stopped near the door. He leaned in, slightly lowering his voice. "You understand this is being documented as a refusal to comply." James looked at him. Really looked. He saw the fatigue there, the practiced distance, the relief of having made a choice, any choice to end the discomfort. "You should be careful how you phrase that," James said. "Words last longer than flights." Thomas straightened, jaw tightening. "Let's go." The door opened. Cool air rushed in from the jet bridge. The plane seemed to exhale behind them, already forgetting. As James stepped across the threshold, a few hands came together in hesitant applause. Not loud, not proud. More like relief, finding somewhere to land. Linda allowed herself a small breath out. Edward leaned back in his new seat legs, stretched, already unbuckling his belt. "Finally," he said. James did not look back. The jet bridge swallowed the sound of the cabin. Footsteps echoed against metal. The walls felt closer here, the lighting harsher. A small airport cart rattled past, driver, glancing over with curiosity before looking away. The officers stopped near a side alcove. One of them pulled out a tablet screen glowing. "Full name," the male officer said. "James Carter." "Date of birth," James answered. The officer typed, frowning slightly, as he waited for the system to catch up. "You're not under arrest," the woman said quietly. "This is just a removal." James nodded. "I understand." The tablet chimed. The officer's brow furrowed. He tapped again, then glanced at his partner. What she asked. "System's lagging," he said. "Probably the network." James watched them without comment. He had seen this pause before. The moment when information brushed up against expectation, and neither quite knew what to do. Behind them, Thomas lingered near the aircraft door. He spoke into his radio voice low, already shifting into cleanup mode. Passenger removed. Documenting refusal. Gate clear. James's phone vibrated once in his pocket. He did not check it. "Sir," the officer said again, "we'll need you to wait here while we finalize the report." "How long?" James asked. "Shouldn't be long." James sat on a metal bench bolted to the wall. The cold seeped through his jacket. He folded his hands again, the same way he had in the seat. Familiar posture, familiar patience. A few minutes passed, maybe more. Time stretched oddly in the jet bridge, unmoored from schedules. The female officer glanced at James, then away. "For what it's worth," she said, "this happens more than people think." James looked at her. "That's exactly why it matters." She nodded once, as if she understood something she could not say out loud. Further down the bridge, a man with a press badge paused, watching from a distance. Grey hair, glasses perched low on his nose. He pretended to check his phone, but his eyes flicked up, taking everything in. James noticed him, filed him away. The officer's tablet chimed again. This time the sound was sharper. He frowned harder, then turned the screen slightly toward his partner. "Hey," he murmured, "this isn't nothing." She leaned in. Her eyes widened just a fraction before she masked it. "What is it Thomas called from behind them?" "Just verifying," the officer said quickly, turning the tablet back. "System delay." Thomas nodded, satisfied enough. He was already half gone, mentally boarding the flight. James's phone vibrated again. Twice. He did not need to read the messages to know what they said. He had been prepared for this part. The delay. The assumption that the story ended when he left the plane. The officer cleared his throat. "Sir," he said, choosing his words carefully, "now we're going to need to escalate this to airport operations." James met his eyes. "That's appropriate." The woman officer shifted her stance. "You sure you don't want to call someone?" she asked quietly. "A lawyer?" "Family." James smiled faintly. Not amused, just aware. Not yet. The plane outside the jet bridge began to move, slowly, deliberately. The engines hummed to life vibration, traveling through the metal beneath their feet. Through the small window, James watched the aircraft pull away, carrying Edward Miller, Linda Peterson, and a cabin full of people already rewriting the story in their heads. To them, this was over. James felt the weight of that assumption settle heavy and useful. He leaned back against the wall eyes, following the plane until it disappeared from view. The jet bridge grew quieter. The urgency drained from the space, replaced by the dull aftertaste of something unfinished. The man with the press badge stepped closer now, curiosity winning out. He studied James's face, the calm, the absence of outrage. "Rough morning," the man said, voice gentle seasoned. James looked at him. "It's still early." The man nodded, as if that answered something he hadn't asked. From somewhere deeper in the terminal, a phone rang. An announcement crackled over the speakers, calling another flight, another group of passengers forward. Life moved on. James remained seated, unmoving, as the pieces continued to slide into place around him. He did not know exactly how the story would be told yet, but he knew this much with certainty. They thought removing him had restored order. What they had done instead was leave the door open. The airport operations office smelled faintly of burnt coffee and disinfectant, a place designed to make people compliant by making them tired. James sat across from a narrow desk, hands folded jacket, still on posture straight. The clock on the wall ticked loud enough to be heard between breaths. Thomas Reynolds stood near the door, arms crossed now, authority settling back into him, like a coat he had shrugged off too early. The security officers hovered to the side, quieter than before. The tablet lay on the desk screen, dark, as if it were waiting for permission to speak. "This doesn't need to be complicated," Thomas said. "We document the incident. You file a complaint if you want. Everyone moves on." James lifted his eyes. "That's not how this ends." Thomas let out a thin laugh. Not humor, disbelief. "You think this is bigger than it is?" James said nothing. Silence did the work for him. The door opened, and a woman stepped in, mid-60s silver hair, pulled back, neatly glasses, perched low. She wore a press badge clipped to her blazer, the kind that had been laminated and relaminated over decades. Susan Walker closed the door gently behind her. "I was told there was an incident worth clarifying," she said, voice calm, practiced, "before paperwork becomes a narrative." Thomas turned, irritation flashing. "This is a restricted area." Susan smiled faintly. So was the airline industry when I started covering it. James watched Thomas's jaw tighten. He had not expected witnesses here. Not this kind. Susan's eyes moved to James, lingering, not with curiosity, with recognition. She had seen men like him before, not the face, the stillness. "I'd like to ask a few questions," she said. Thomas shook his head. "We're not doing interviews." "You already did," Susan replied. "In the cabin." She pulled out a small recorder and placed it on the desk, did not turn it on. The gesture alone shifted the room. James leaned back slightly. The chair creaked. Thomas exhaled. 5 minutes. Susan nodded, once efficient. She turned to James. "Sir, did the airline verify your boarding status before requesting your removal?" "No," James said. "Did you refuse to comply with any lawful instruction?" "No." "Did you raise your voice, threaten anyone, interfere with operations?" "No." Susan glanced at Thomas. "That's 3 no's that don't align with your report." Thomas bristled. "We haven't finalized anything." "Good," Susan said, "because I'd hate to correct it publicly." The security officers shifted again. One of them cleared his throat. James felt his phone vibrate for the 3rd time. This time, he reached into his pocket and checked it. A single message. No name, just text. Phase 1, complete. Hold position. James locked the screen and returned the phone to his pocket. Susan noticed. She noticed everything. "Mr. Carter," she said, lowering her voice just slightly. "May I ask what you do for a living?" Thomas opened his mouth. James spoke first. "I manage investments." Susan's eyebrow lifted a fraction. "That's broad." James met her gaze. "It needs to be." Susan smiled, not satisfied, but intrigued. Outside the office window, baggage carts rolled past. Somewhere a child laughed. The airport kept breathing. Thomas stepped forward. "This conversation is over." Susan gathered her recorder, still unused. "Then I'll ask my questions elsewhere." She turned to James. "If you're willing?" James stood. "I am." Thomas's voice sharpened. "Sir, you're still under review." James paused at the door. "Then you should review. Carefully." They walked out together. The hallway was brighter, louder. People moved around them, unaware of the quiet fracture spreading beneath the surface. Susan did not speak until they reached a row of chairs overlooking the tarmac. Planes taxied in the distance, massive bodies moving with deceptive ease. "You're not rattled," Susan said. "I've been rattled before," James replied. "This isn't that." She studied him. "You let them take you off the plane?" "Yes." "You could have stopped it." "Yes." Susan nodded slowly. "Then you're either reckless or deliberate." James looked out at the runway. Reckless people react. Deliberate people wait. Susan chuckled softly. That sounds rehearsed. It's learned. They sat. Silence settled between them, companionable. You know, Susan said after a moment, this industry has a long memory and a short conscience. James turned to her. That's why patterns matter more than moments. Her eyes sharpened now. You think this is a pattern? I know it is. Susan leaned back. I've chased patterns for 40 years. Most disappear when you get close. James's phone vibrated again. He did not check it this time. This one won't, he said. Across the tarmac, the plane that had carried Edward Miller and Linda Peterson lifted off wheels, leaving the ground body tilting upward. James watched it climb. Susan followed his gaze. Someone on that plane thinks they won. James smiled faintly. They always do at this stage. Susan turned fully toward him now. Stage. James met her eyes. Stories have stages. Systems do too. She held his gaze, then reached into her bag and pulled out a folded newspaper. She slid it toward him. A small article buried near the bottom of the page. An older complaint. A familiar airline. A familiar outcome, buried, Susan said. I wrote it. Years ago. James unfolded it carefully. Read, folded it back. They called it an isolated incident, he said. Susan nodded. They always do. James stood. It won't stay isolated. Susan rose with him. When does the other shoe drop? James considered her. The question? The risk. Sooner than they expect, he said. Slower than they deserve. From down the hall, Thomas Reynolds emerged, face tight. Mr. Carter, he called. We need you back inside. James turned. Susan stayed where she was. Thomas lowered his voice as James approached. We're seeing some inconsistencies in the system. I need to understand why. James stopped a few feet away. Understanding requires listening. Thomas swallowed. Who are you? James did not answer. He walked past Thomas, back into the office, the door closing behind him, with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have. Susan watched from the hallway as the walls absorbed him again. She took out her recorder at last and turned it on thumb steady. Note, she said quietly. Airport operations, unidentified passenger, elevated response, signs of institutional overreach. She slipped the recorder back into her bag as a notification buzzed on her phone. An editor, a single line. If this goes where I think it's going, don't blink. Susan looked once more at the closed door. Inside, James sat down again, hands folding, breath steady, as Thomas Reynolds stared at a screen that had finally decided to speak. The system had begun to answer questions no one had asked out loud, and it was only getting started. The screen on Thomas Reynolds's desk refreshed once then again, as if reluctant to confirm what it already knew. A small icon pulsed in the corner, amber turning to red, then settling into a steady blue. Thomas leaned closer, glasses slipping down his nose, breath shallow. That can't be right, he murmured. James watched from across the desk, still unreadable. He did not lean in. He did not need to. The younger security officer stood behind Thomas, now eyes fixed on the screen. That profile doesn't populate unless there's a flag, he said quietly. And those don't come from customer service. Thomas clicked again. The name line remained blank, but the metadata beneath it kept filling itself in. Corporate access points, oversight tags, restricted audit markers. Who did you say you were again? Thomas asked, not looking up. I didn't, James replied. The room felt smaller. The ticking clock seemed louder, more impatient. Linda Peterson's voice crackled through the speaker on Thomas's desk. Are we clear to push back? She asked. We're already behind. Thomas didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed on the screen. Stand by, he said finally. A pause. What's going on? Linda pressed. We're verifying. Thomas said. James noticed the shift immediately. Not in words, in tone. The certainty had drained away, replaced by something brittle. Outside the office, Susan Walker lingered near the vending machines, pretending to examine the choices, while her ears tracked every raised voice, every clipped sentence. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from her editor. Short. Careful. Proceed. But don't publish yet. Susan exhaled slowly. She slipped the phone back into her pocket and looked toward the closed door. Inside, Thomas straightened. He turned the monitor slightly, just enough that James could see the edge of a chart, the bold heading at the top. Internal Compliance Review. Active. You're under some kind of audit, Thomas said. That doesn't make sense. James met his gaze. It does if you stop assuming it's about me. Thomas frowned. Then what is it about? James said nothing. The security officer shifted his stance. Sir, he said to Thomas, this level of access usually corresponds to, I know what it corresponds to. Thomas snapped, then caught himself. He took a breath, ran a hand over his face. I just didn't expect to see it here. He looked back at James, eyes searching now. Why didn't you say anything? James's voice was quiet. You didn't ask the right questions. Thomas laughed once, sharp and humorless. You let this happen? Yes. On purpose? Yes. Thomas sank into his chair. The authority he carried like armor began to feel heavy. You understand what this means for us? James nodded. That depends on what you do next. The silence stretched. Outside, the distant roar of engines rose and fell. Another flight departed. Another story ended before it started. Linda's voice came through the speaker again, tighter now. Thomas, we have passengers asking questions. Thomas leaned toward the desk. Delayed departure. There was a beat of disbelief on the line. We can't keep doing that. We can, Thomas said. And we will. He ended the call and stared at the blank wall for a moment, as if hoping it might tell him what to do. James watched him closely. He saw the conflict there. Not good versus bad. Convenience versus consequence. You know, Thomas said slowly, in my 30 years doing this, every problem starts the same way. Someone doesn't fit the pattern. James inclined his head slightly. And the system reacts. Thomas looked up. It pushes back, or it exposes itself, James said. A knock sounded at the door. Thomas flinched. Susan stepped in without waiting to be invited. Apologies, she said lightly. Security said you might need clarification on the record. Thomas opened his mouth to object, then closed it. He looked tired now. Older than his years. Susan's eyes flicked to the screen, then back to James. Her expression did not change, but something behind it sharpened. Well, she said that explains the delay. Thomas stood. This is an internal matter. Susan nodded. Everything is until it isn't. She turned to James. Do you mind if I ask one question? James looked at Thomas. Thomas hesitated, then waved a hand, defeated. Go ahead. Susan's voice was steady. Did you intend for this to escalate? James considered the question. I intended to observe what would happen if I did nothing to stop it. Susan nodded slowly. And are you satisfied with what you've seen? James's gaze drifted to the window, to the planes lined up like obedient machines. Satisfied is the wrong word. Thomas swallowed. What happens now? James turned back to him. Now you decide whether this becomes an incident or a pattern. Thomas laughed weakly. I don't have that kind of power. James leaned forward for the first time. Not aggressive, focused. You had enough power to remove me from a plane without verifying my credentials. Don't underestimate the power you still have. Susan watched the exchange mind already racing ahead, Mapping headlines, timelines, consequences. Her phone buzzed again. She glanced at it. A single word from her editor. Confirm. Susan looked up. My editors are asking questions, she said. They've noticed the delay. They're pulling old complaints. Thomas closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, something had shifted. Resignation, resolve. Maybe both. I need to make a call, he said. He stepped out of the office phone, already at his ear. James remained seated. Susan took the chair across from him. You're not just testing them, she said quietly. You're testing yourself. James smiled faintly. I already know who I am. Susan studied him. And who is that? James's phone vibrated. He checked it this time. Another message. Same number. Phase 2 authorized. Maintain visibility. He locked the screen. Someone who's tired of pretending this is accidental. Susan exhaled. You know what happens when this goes public? James nodded. Yes. You'll be attacked, discredited, labeled. Yes. Even by people who look like you. James met her eyes. Especially by them. Susan leaned back. Then why do it? James's answer was immediate. Because nothing changes if the cost is always paid by someone else. The door opened. Thomas returned, face pale. They're grounding the aircraft, he said. Temporarily. Susan's eyebrows rose. That's not small. Thomas shook his head. Neither is what I just heard. He looked at James, something like respect creeping in despite himself. Corporate compliance is involved now. Full review. James stood. The movement seemed to reset the room. Good, he said. Then we're finally having the right conversation. Outside alarms chimed softly as ground crews moved to redirect the plane. Passengers would grumble. Schedules would shift. Blame would be assigned. Susan gathered her things. I'm going to need a statement. James looked at her. Not yet. She smiled. I figured. As she turned to leave, she paused. For what it's worth, she said, systems hate mirrors. James nodded. That's why they need them. When the door closed behind her, James and Thomas stood facing each other, the weight of what had begun settling fully now. Somewhere above them, a flight path changed, and with it, the direction of everything that followed. The announcement came without ceremony. No apology, no explanation. Just a calm female voice over the terminal speakers informing passengers that the flight to San Francisco had been temporarily delayed due to an operational review. The word review landed softly, but it rippled outward like a stone dropped into water. James stood near the window, now watching the aircraft sit motionless at the gate, its nose pointed forward, as if it still believed it would leave. Ground crew gathered in a loose cluster beneath the wing radios, crackling heads bent together. Nothing about their posture suggested routine. Behind him, Thomas Reynolds paced the length of the office phone, pressed tight to his ear. His voice stayed low, controlled, but the muscles in his neck betrayed him. He wasn't giving orders anymore. He was answering questions. Yes, Thomas said. I understand. No, I didn't know at the time. That's what we're trying to determine. James listened without turning around. The cadence was familiar. He had heard it from men who realized too late that they had mistaken authority for immunity. Thomas ended the call and stood still for a moment, staring at the floor, as if it might offer guidance. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, less defensive, more careful. They're pulling records, he said. Not just from today. James nodded slightly. They won't stop at today. Thomas rubbed his hands together. How far back does this go? As far back as people stopped asking why, James replied. Outside, a service truck rolled past, its engine loud in the stillness. A few passengers gathered near the gate desk, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the agents who now avoided eye contact. Susan Walker reappeared in the doorway, notepad in hand, glasses lowered. "The delay just hit the boards," she said, and so did the chatter. Thomas looked at her warily. "You promised time." "I promised restraint," Susan said, "not silence." She glanced at James. "Your name's starting to circulate." James turned from the window. "Not yet." Susan's lips curved faintly. "It never stays that way." A knock interrupted them. This time it was firm, official. The door opened to reveal a man in a dark suit, no tie badge clipped to his belt instead of his lapel. He looked around the room with the practiced calm of someone used to walking into tension. "Airport compliance," he said. "I'm Mark Ellis." Thomas straightened immediately. "Thomas Reynolds, operations supervisor." Mark nodded, then turned to James. His gaze lingered a second longer than necessary. "Sir?" James inclined his head. "Mr. Ellis?" Mark gestured toward the desk. "I'm going to ask a few questions." Susan raised an eyebrow. "On the record." Mark looked at her. "For now?" James sat. The chair creaked again, familiar sound grounding. Mark pulled out a folder, thick already dog-eared. "You were removed from the aircraft after refusing a crew instruction," Mark said. "No," James replied. "I was removed after requesting verification." Mark paused, pen hovering. "That's your statement?" "Yes." Mark glanced at Thomas. "Was verification attempted?" Thomas hesitated. "Just long enough." "No," he said. Mark wrote something down. The scratch of pen against paper sounded louder than it should have, and the decision to remove him, Mark continued, was based on what? Thomas swallowed. "Operational urgency." Mark looked up. "Not safety." "No." "Not disorder." "No." Mark closed the folder halfway. "Then we have a problem." The room seemed to contract around those words. Susan watched closely, eyes flicking between faces, cataloguing reactions. The security officers near the wall shifted again, their earlier confidence gone. James felt the familiar weight settle in his chest. The point of no return. Once named things could not be unnamed. Mark turned to James. "I need to ask directly. Do you have any affiliations with the airline beyond this ticket?" James met his gaze. "Yes." Thomas stiffened. Mark waited. "I am a shareholder," James said, "and an external advisor on governance risk." The words landed clean. No flourish, no reveal, just fact. Susan inhaled sharply. She had expected something. "Not that." Thomas's face drained of color. "You're what?" James did not look at him. "You didn't ask." Mark's expression tightened. Why withhold that information? "Because the system behaves differently when it knows who it's dealing with," James said. "I needed to see how it behaved when it didn't." Silence pressed in, heavy, unforgiving. Mark leaned back slightly. "This wasn't a sting." "No," James replied. "This was observation." Susan closed her notebook slowly. "You let them choose." James nodded. "They always do." Outside, a raised voice carried through the hallway, a passenger demanding answers, another calling a spouse. The delay had teeth now. Mark stood. "I need to escalate this." Thomas looked like he might sit down or collapse. Mark paused at the door. "Mr. Reynolds, you may want to contact your legal department." Thomas nodded weakly. After Mark left the room, felt emptied out, as if something essential had been removed along with him. Susan broke the silence. "That's it then." James shook his head. "No, that's the middle." Susan studied him. "You know they'll come for you." "Yes. They'll question your motives, your timing, your ethics." "Yes. They'll say you manufactured this." James's voice was steady. "They manufacture worse every day by pretending it doesn't happen." Susan leaned back, considering. When this breaks, it won't just be about one flight. James looked at the grounded aircraft again. It never is. Thomas sank into a chair, hands covering his face. I thought I was doing my job. James turned to him. You were. That's the problem. Thomas looked up, eyes wet. What happens to me? James did not soften his answer. That depends on whether you tell the truth. Outside sirens wailed briefly, then faded. The airport moved on, but something beneath it had shifted. Susan's phone buzzed. She checked it, then looked up. My editor wants a confirmation. James considered the room, the people in it, the weight of the moment. Give them this, he said. An airline delayed a flight today because it finally looked at itself. Susan nodded. That'll light a fire. James watched as she left, already typing. Thomas remained seated, staring at nothing. James returned to the window. The plane still hadn't moved. A technician climbed the stairs toward the cockpit, now clipboard in hand. A small act. A visible one. He felt his phone vibrate again. He didn't need to read it to know what it meant. The system had noticed, and systems once aware rarely stopped at apologies. They retaliated, or they reformed. James exhaled slowly, the breath steady, deliberate. Either way, the flight that mattered had already taken off. Phones started ringing before the aircraft doors reopened, not the polite chime of incoming calls, but the sharper vibration that made people glance at screens and frown. Gate agents leaned closer together. A supervisor whispered into a headset and shook her head. The delay was no longer an inconvenience. It had become a question. James sat in a quiet corner of the operations office, now no longer the center of the room, but the reason for its unease. Thomas Reynolds remained at his desk, posture collapsed inward, staring at an email he had read 3 times without absorbing. The subject line alone was enough to drain the blood from his face. Corporate legal. Immediate. Outside the glass wall, 2 men in suits approached at a pace that suggested urgency, wrapped in restraint. One carried a leather portfolio. The other held a phone pressed tight to his ear, murmuring assurances that sounded rehearsed. "They're here," Thomas said, voice flat. James stood as the door opened. The men entered without introducing themselves at first eyes, already scanning the room, cataloguing faces' exit screens. James Carter, the taller one, said, finally, "I'm Daniel Hargrove. This is my colleague, Paul Bennett. We represent the airline." James nodded. I assumed. Daniel glanced at Thomas, then back to James. "We understand there's been a misunderstanding." James did not smile. "There's been a decision." Paul shifted, opening the portfolio. "Let's slow this down. Flights get delayed every day. Emotions run high. We don't need this to become something it isn't." James met his eyes. "It already is." Daniel folded his hands. "You're a shareholder." "Yes." "A significant one." "Yes." Daniel exhaled. "Then you understand fiduciary responsibility?" James tilted his head slightly. "I understand accountability." Paul leaned forward. Dragging the company through public scrutiny hurts everyone. Employees, passengers, investors. James's gaze hardened. So does hiding harm. The hum of the airport filtered through the glass. A cart rattled past. Someone laughed nearby, unaware of the weight pressing down in this room. Daniel tried a different approach. "What do you want?" James did not answer immediately. He walked to the window and looked out at the grounded aircraft. Passengers were being rebooked now. Some angry, some confused, all inconvenienced. "I want the truth documented," James said finally. "I want the pattern acknowledged, And I want safeguards that don't disappear when the cameras turn off. Paul scoffed softly. That's vague. It's precise, James replied. You're just not used to hearing it. Thomas cleared his throat. They're pulling old incident reports, he said quietly. More than a few. Daniel shot him a sharp look. You didn't mention that. Thomas spread his hands, helplessly. I didn't know. James watched the exchange with detached focus. This was the fracture point, where loyalty bent toward survival. Daniel straightened. James, let's be candid. This could get ugly. James turned. It already has. Just not for the right people yet. Paul closed the portfolio. If this goes public, the narrative won't be kind. You'll be painted as vindictive. Opportunistic. James's voice dropped. I was removed from a seat I paid for without verification. Daniel nodded. Perception matters. So does evidence. A knock sounded. Susan Walker stepped in, breathless eyes bright. The story's live, she said. Verified, balanced, it's already spreading. Daniel swore under his breath. Paul rubbed his temples. Thomas looked up, panic flickering. Already. Susan nodded. People are sharing their own stories now. Comment sections are filling up. James closed his eyes briefly. Not in relief, in recognition. This was the part that always surprised people. The chorus that followed once someone sang the first note. Daniel turned on Susan. You were told to wait. Susan met his glare. I waited long enough. Phones buzzed again. And again. Notifications stacked like falling dominoes. Paul checked his screen, face tightening. We've got inquiries from regulators. Daniel inhaled sharply. That was fast. James opened his eyes. It always is when truth is delayed. Daniel faced him squarely now. You planned this. James did not deny it. I allowed it. Susan watched the exchange, mind racing ahead. They're calling it a systems failure, she said. Not an isolated incident. Paul snapped his portfolio shut. We need to get ahead of this. James's tone was unyielding. You're already behind. Outside, a small crowd gathered near the gate desk phones, out voices rising. Security staff repositioned, subtly not to control but to contain. Daniel lowered his voice. James, as counsel, I'm advising you to consider the broader implications. James stepped closer. As a human being, I'm advising you to consider the narrower ones. The people who sit quietly and comply because they're told that's the price of travel. Silence fell, heavy, uncomfortable. Thomas spoke again, voice trembling. There's something else. All eyes turned to him. They found an internal memo, he said, from 2 years ago. Training recommendations. Never implemented. Paul's shoulders sagged. Jesus. Susan's pen moved quickly. She didn't look up. James exhaled slowly. That's the cost of delay. Daniel rubbed his face. We can issue a statement. Suspend the employee involved. James shook his head. That's a bandage, Paul snapped. Then what do you want, James? Blood. James's eyes flashed. I want change. The room seemed to still around those words. Susan looked up now. The public's watching how you respond. Daniel straightened. We'll convene an emergency board call. James nodded. I'll attend. Paul hesitated. As what? James held his gaze. As someone you should have listened to before today. Another vibration. This one different. James checked his phone. Board call scheduled. 30 minutes. He slipped the phone back into his pocket. Daniel looked at him, realization dawning. You already moved. James said nothing. Outside the terminal, buzzed with energy, anger, curiosity. A story unfolding in real time. Susan packed her bag. I'll stay close, she said to James. He nodded. Be fair. She smiled faintly. Always. Daniel and Paul exchanged a look. This was no longer damage control. It was triage. Thomas slumped into his chair as they left, head in his hands. I thought keeping things moving was my job. James placed a hand briefly on his shoulder. It is. But sometimes the right direction isn't forward. Thomas looked up, eyes glassy. What happens to me? James's answer was quiet. That depends on whether you help stop this from happening again. Outside the window, another plane taxied into position, oblivious. James returned his gaze to the grounded aircraft. The story had escaped the room, now taking on a life of its own. He felt the familiar tightening in his chest, not fear, but resolve. The call would come. The questions would sharpen. The pressure would rise. He welcomed it, because the silence had finally broken, and once broken, it never went back together the same way. The board call opened without pleasantries. No greetings, no small talk. Just a grid of faces blinking into existence on the screen, each framed by polished offices, muted lighting, and the kind of calm that came from believing control still belonged to them. James sat alone at the conference table, the laptop centered in front of him. He did not adjust the camera. He did not straighten his jacket. Let them see him as he was. Let's get this started, a man with silver hair said. Harold Whitman, chairman, late 70s. Voice thin but practiced. We're dealing with a public situation that requires immediate containment. Containment. The word landed exactly where James expected. Another face spoke up. A woman in her early 60s, sharp haircut eyes, already irritated. Our stock dipped 3% in the last hour. Media inquiries are accelerating. A third voice cut in. This is a customer service failure, not a governance issue. James leaned forward slightly. The movement was subtle, but it shifted the room. It became a governance issue the moment removal was chosen over verification. He said. A pause. Screens froze for half a second as bandwidth adjusted, or perhaps as people recalibrated. Harold frowned. Mr. Carter, we appreciate your perspective, but this is not the forum for personal grievances. James met his gaze through the screen. Then you misunderstand why I'm here. A murmur rippled across the grid. Names flickered beneath faces. Directors, legal counsel, advisors, people who had not sat in seat 2A and never would. This incident, Harold continued, is being reviewed internally. Appropriate steps will be taken. James nodded once. That phrase appears in every unresolved complaint filed over the last decade. Silence. Thicker this time. A man off to the side cleared his throat. What complaints? James tapped a key. The screen shared changed. A simple list appeared. Dates, flight numbers, outcomes, no action taken. Closed, resolved. One by one, faces leaned closer to their cameras. These are not allegations, James said. They are records, buried ones. A woman with glasses leaned back. Where did you get this? From your own systems, James replied. They were never deleted, just ignored. Legal counsel spoke up now, voice cautious. Mr. Carter, distributing internal data like this is not what I'm doing, James interrupted. I'm reflecting it back to you. Harold's jaw tightened. You orchestrated this. James did not flinch. I walked onto a plane and sat in my assigned seat. That's disingenuous. No, James said. It's precise. Another director leaned forward, younger than the rest, eyes sharp. Are you suggesting the airline has a pattern of discriminatory enforcement? James looked directly at her. I'm saying the evidence already suggests it. I'm asking what you plan to do with that knowledge. The grid went quiet. Somewhere, A notification chimed and was quickly muted. Harold exhaled slowly. This company employs tens of thousands of people. We cannot allow one incident to undermine trust. James's voice hardened. Trust is already undermined. You're just hearing about it now. A different voice entered, calmer. What exactly are you proposing? James took a breath. This was the moment. Not a reveal. A line in the ground. I'm proposing an independent compliance audit, he said. Publicly acknowledged. I'm proposing mandatory bias and de-escalation training overseen by external regulators. And I'm proposing that removals without verification be prohibited outright. A director scoffed. That would slow operations. James met his eyes. So does grounding aircraft. The tension spiked. Harold raised a hand. Enough. This is not how decisions are made. James leaned back. Then let me remind you how ownership works. A beat. 2. I hold a controlling voting interest, James said calmly, through direct and proxy holdings. Several faces froze. That's not possible, someone said. James slid another document onto the shared screen. Clean. Verified. Numbers spelled out clearly. Harold stared at the screen. Color drained from his face. You never disclosed this, Harold said. I was never asked, James replied. Legal counsel spoke quickly now. This changes the context. James nodded. It always does. Silence fell again, but this time it was different, heavier, weighted with consequence. A woman near the bottom of the grid spoke softly. If we fight this, we lose. Heads turned. She continued. If we deny it, more will surface. If we minimize it, regulators will step in. Harold closed his eyes briefly. And if we comply? James answered for her. You regain credibility. Slowly. Painfully. But honestly. The chairman opened his eyes. You're forcing our hand. James's reply was immediate. Your hand was forced long before today. You just felt it now. Another vibration. James glanced at his phone. A message from Susan. Whistleblowers coming forward. Multiple. James locked the screen. The public narrative is already moving, he said. You can either follow it or be run over by it. Harold leaned back, suddenly looking his age. What about the employees involved? James did not hesitate. Accountability is not cruelty, it's clarity. A long pause. Faces exchanged looks. Calculations ran silently. Finally Harold spoke. We'll vote. The screen shifted. Poll icons appeared. James waited. He did not watch the votes appear. He watched faces instead. Some resigned, some relieved, some angry. The final tally locked in. Motion carried. An independent audit. Immediate suspension of removal authority, pending verification. Public acknowledgement of failure. The meeting ended without ceremony. Screens blinked out one by one. James sat alone again, the hum of the terminal filling the space the voices had occupied. He stood slowly. His legs felt heavy now. Not from fear, from release. Outside the glass, Susan stood with her phone pressed to her ear, nodding as she listened. She caught his eye and raised a thumb. Not celebration, confirmation. James picked up his jacket and walked toward the door. As he stepped back into the terminal, the noise hit him. Voices, announcements, rolling suitcases, life continuing. A man near the gate recognized him and stared. Then another. Whispers began. James kept walking. He did not seek the cameras gathering near the entrance. He did not avoid them either. This part was no longer his to control, but as he passed the spot where he had first been stopped, he paused for just a moment and looked back at the aircraft gate. Seat 2A was empty now, not because it had been taken, because something larger had shifted around it. James turned and walked on, knowing the hardest part was still ahead. Systems resisted change, but once exposed, they never forgot the moment someone stood still and made them reveal themselves. By nightfall, the airport no longer belonged to the airline. It belonged to the story. Television crews lined the outer curb, red lights blinking against the dark like warning beacons. Reporters stood shoulder to shoulder, microphones, poised voices rising over one another, as producers shouted cues through earpieces. Inside, security tightened not to keep people out, but to slow the flood of attention pressing in. James moved through a side corridor, away from the noise guided by an airport liaison, who spoke too fast and apologized too often. His phone buzzed constantly now, messages stacked faster than he could read them. Old colleagues, new allies, people who had waited years for permission to speak. He stopped near a glass wall overlooking the runway. The night sky was clear, planes lifted off in steady intervals, engines roaring, lights cutting through the dark. The rhythm was comforting. Order still existed somewhere. Susan Walker found him there. She looked tired, energized, both at once. It's everywhere, she said. Cable, online, radio. They're looping the footage and pairing it with internal memos. James nodded. Patterns don't like daylight. Susan leaned against the glass. You know what happens next. They push back, James said. Hard. As if summoned by the words, his phone vibrated with a different tone. He glanced at the screen. Board subcommittee request. Emergency session. Tonight. He locked the phone and slid it back into his pocket. They're not done, Susan said quietly. No, James replied. They're deciding how to survive me. Susan studied his face. And how are you holding up? James took a breath. The question landed heavier than the others. I'm focused. That wasn't the question. James looked out at the runway again. He saw flashes of memory instead. His mother's hands tightening on the steering wheel when pulled over. His own reflection in boardroom glass, always double-checking the room before speaking. I'm tired, he said, finally. But I'm not surprised. Susan nodded. The difference matters. A group of airport employees passed behind them, walking slower than usual, eyes flicking toward James with a mix of curiosity and something else. Recognition. Relief. Fear. Susan followed his gaze. They're watching what happens to you. James understood. This was no longer just about him. It never had been. A commotion rose near the terminal entrance. Raised voices. Security moving in a practiced arc. James could already guess. Linda Peterson emerged from the crowd, escorted but not restrained, face pale, posture rigid. She looked smaller without the uniform authority had given her. Cameras swung toward her instantly. She's been placed on administrative leave, Susan said. Corporate move. James watched as Linda shielded her face, lips moving in protest. He felt no satisfaction, only the weight of inevitability. That's not accountability, he said. That's optics. Susan didn't disagree. Optics are all they have right now. Linda disappeared through a side door. The crowd surged, disappointed. James's phone buzzed again. Another message. Unknown number. I was removed last year. Same reason, same supervisor. I kept quiet. Thank you. James closed his eyes briefly. They're coming forward, Susan said. Yes, James replied, because someone stood long enough for them to catch up. A voice called James's name. He turned to see Daniel Hargrove approaching. Jacket off, now tie, loosened the polished confidence replaced by strain. They want to talk, Daniel said. Now. James met his eyes. They already did. Daniel lowered his voice. This is bigger than the board. Regulators are circling. James nodded. They should. Daniel hesitated. You didn't have to do it this way. James's voice was calm. "There is no other way that lasts." Daniel looked away, jaw tight. "They're considering challenging your disclosures." James raised an eyebrow. "On what grounds?" "Process," Daniel said weakly. James almost smiled. "Process is exactly what failed." Daniel exhaled. "They're scared." James leaned closer. "Good." Daniel straightened defensive again. "Careful. You're not invincible." James's gaze was steady. "I don't need to be." Daniel walked away, shoulders tense. Susan watched him go. "They'll try to isolate you." James nodded. "They always do." She tilted her head. "You're not alone this time." James felt the truth settle. He had allies now he hadn't planned for, that he hadn't controlled. That was new. An announcement crackled overhead, calling a late flight to board. Life pressed on around the rupture. James's phone buzzed once more. This time he answered. "Yes," he said quietly. A voice on the other end spoke fast, urgent. He listened, expression tightening. "I understand," he said after a moment. "Send everything." He hung up and looked at Susan. "More documents," he said. "Training budgets cut, complaints rerouted, incentives tied to minimizing disruptions." Susan's eyes widened. "That's systemic." "Yes." She pulled out her phone. "My editor's going to want this." "Verify first," James said. "Always." She smiled. "You really are impossible to rush." James's phone vibrated again. A different contact this time. "Mother?" He hesitated, then answered. "I'm fine," he said before she could speak. A pause, then her voice steady but tight. "I saw you on the news." James closed his eyes. "I know." "You look tired," she said. He smiled faintly. "You always notice." "Are you safe?" James looked around the terminal. Security. Cameras. People watching. "Yes." Another pause. "Your father would be proud," she said. The words hit harder than any headline. "I hope so," James replied. When he hung up, Susan was watching him with a softness she hadn't shown before. "This costs you," she said. "Yes." "And you keep going anyway?" "Yes." Susan nodded. "That's the part people don't see." James looked back toward the entrance where the cameras waited. He knew he would have to face them soon. Not to explain himself. To set the terms. His phone chimed with a calendar alert. Emergency board session. 10 minutes. He straightened his jacket, squared his shoulders. "Ready?" Susan asked. James took one last look at the runway, at the planes rising into the dark. "No," he said, "but prepared." He walked toward the glass doors, toward the lights, toward the noise. Behind him, the airport kept moving. Ahead of him, the system braced. And somewhere in between, a line had been crossed that could not be uncrossed. The emergency board session began with the sound of doors closing. Not slamming. Sealing. James felt it even before he saw the room, the way the air changed when too many people gathered to decide how much truth they could afford. The conference space was smaller than the one earlier, more private, more guarded. A long oval table, frosted glass walls, no windows, no audience, just faces and fear and calculation. James took his seat without greeting anyone. Around him, directors settled into chairs, legal counsel lined the back wall, phones placed face down as if temptation itself had become dangerous. Harold Whitman sat at the head of the table again, his hands clasped tightly, knuckles pale. He did not look at James at first. "We're here," Harold began, voice steady but thinner now, because this situation has escalated beyond expectation. James leaned back slightly. That happens when expectations are built on denial. A few heads turned. A few pens paused. Harold pressed on. "Regulators have requested documentation. Media attention has intensified. Investor confidence is volatile." A woman to Harold's right spoke sharply. "You blindsided us." James met her gaze. "No." I removed the blindfold. Murmurs rippled. This was no longer a discussion about public relations. It was about survival. Legal counsel cleared his throat. "We need to establish boundaries. Certain disclosures may expose the company to litigation." James folded his hands. "The exposure already exists. The question is whether you want it uncovered by auditors or excavated by prosecutors." That landed. Hard. Another director leaned forward. Younger. Less insulated. "What exactly do you have?" James looked around the table, meeting each face in turn. Enough. Silence followed. Long. Uncomfortable. Harold exhaled slowly. "We need cooperation." James nodded. "You'll have it, after transparency." A director scoffed. "You're holding the company hostage." James's voice hardened. "Hostage situations involve innocence. This is accountability." The door at the far end of the room opened quietly. A woman entered mid-50s, composed hair streaked with grey eyes, alert in a way that suggested she had learned to read danger long before most people noticed it. Conversation stopped. "This is Dr. Elaine Foster," Harold said reluctantly. "Former compliance officer." James turned fully toward her. Recognition flickered. Not personal. Professional. Dr. Foster took a seat without waiting to be invited. "You asked for independent oversight," she said, voice calm. "Here it is." Harold bristled. This was not agreed. Elaine cut him off gently. It was inevitable. She turned to James. "I reviewed the materials you referenced. Training cancellations, complaint rerouting, incentive structures." James nodded. "What's your assessment?" Elaine folded her hands. "This company optimized for speed and comfort at the expense of dignity. Over time, that became culture. The word culture hung in the air like an accusation. A director snapped, "That's subjective." Elaine met his stare. "The data disagrees." She slid a folder across the table. Charts, timelines, patterns too consistent to dismiss. James watched the room absorb it. The shift was visible now. This was no longer about him. Harold's voice dropped. "If we acknowledge this publicly, we invite lawsuits," Elaine replied. "If you don't, you invite indictments." James spoke then, slow and deliberate. "This is the moment where institutions decide who they are when no one forces them." The woman who had accused him earlier spoke again, quieter now. "What do you want from us?" James leaned forward. The room stilled. "I want governance reform," he said. "Independent compliance reporting directly to the board. Removal protocols that require verification. Transparent complaint tracking. And consequences that don't stop at the lowest rung." Harold shook his head. "That's a structural overhaul." "Yes. Investors will panic." James held his gaze. "They already are. The difference is whether they panic at secrecy or respect honesty." Elaine nodded. "Markets recover from truth faster than scandal." A younger director glanced around. "What about the employees involved?" James did not flinch. "Investigate. Fairly, thoroughly. No scapegoats, no shields." Harold closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, something had changed. The man who had once commanded the room now sounded like someone negotiating with time. "We'll need a vote," he said. James nodded. Of course, the vote took longer this time. Discussions broke out. Legal whispered. Advisors scribbled notes. Elaine remained silent, waiting. James felt the weight of the hours catch up to him. Not exhaustion. Something deeper. The cost of insisting. Finally, Harold spoke. "Motion to initiate full governance reform, appoint independent compliance authority, and publicly acknowledge systemic failure." Hands rose. Slowly. Reluctantly. Then one by one, more. The motion passed. A collective breath escaped the room. Harold looked at James. This doesn't end the scrutiny. James stood. It begins the repair. Elaine gathered her folder. I'll need full access, she said. Harold nodded. You'll have it. James turned to leave. As he reached the door, Harold called after him. James. James paused. You could have waited, Harold said. Handled this quietly. James looked back. Quiet is how this lasted so long. He stepped out into the hallway. The noise from outside was muted here, but he could feel it. The world pressing in. Susan waited at the end of the corridor phone, in hand, eyes, searching his face. It passed, James said. She let out a breath she'd been holding. Then it's real. James nodded. Now it's hard. They walked together toward the exit. As they passed a window, James caught his reflection. Older than this morning, sharper too. His phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. I was afraid to speak. Not anymore. James closed his eyes briefly. Outside, the cameras waited, questions loaded, narratives forming. James stepped forward anyway, because the system had finally blinked, and when it did, it revealed something it could never hide again. Morning came quietly, as if the night had not torn anything open. The terminal windows filled with pale light planes, lined up like obedient machines, waiting for clearance, and the airport returned to its familiar rhythm of footsteps and rolling bags. But beneath that routine, something irreversible had settled. James stood alone near the observation window, coffee untouched in his hand. He had not slept, not because of adrenaline or fear, but because his mind refused to release the weight of what had begun. Systems didn't change overnight. They resisted, adapted, disguised themselves. He knew that better than anyone. Behind him, Susan Walker spoke softly into her phone, her voice steady practiced. She had already filed 3 follow-ups. Not opinion pieces, not outrage, documentation, patterns, names, the kind of reporting that stayed alive long after outrage burned out. James watched a plane taxi past sunlight catching the fuselage. Somewhere on board, passengers settled into seats, adjusted vents, opened books, trusting the invisible machinery that carried them. Trust was fragile. It always had been. A notification buzzed on his phone. He glanced at it, then another. Messages from employees, from former passengers, from people who had once written complaints and never heard back. The same sentence appeared again and again, phrased differently, but meaning the same thing. I thought it was just me. He closed his eyes briefly, letting that truth land. Linda Peterson's name surfaced in one of the updates. Administrative leave confirmed. Review pending. It was already being framed as decisive action. James felt no satisfaction. Accountability without context became theatre. He had no interest in theatre. Thomas Reynolds's name appeared too. Internal investigation. Cooperation noted. The language was careful, transitional. He wondered how Thomas was holding up, whether the weight of his own decision had finally reached him. People rarely intended harm. They intended speed, comfort, approval. That was how damage spread. James turned as footsteps approached. Dr. Elaine Foster stopped beside him, tablet tucked under her arm, expression unreadable. They're moving faster than I expected, she said. They had to, James replied. Momentum doesn't wait. Elaine studied the terminal below. There will be pushback. Yes. From inside, yes. She nodded. From you too. James met her gaze. Good. Elaine allowed herself a small smile. You know, most people with your position would have handled this privately. James took a sip of coffee at last, grimaced, set it down. Private solutions keep public problems alive. Elaine's tablet chimed. She glanced at it. The Oversight Committee is scheduled. External auditors confirmed. Federal liaisons acknowledged. James exhaled slowly. The architecture of reform was assembling piece by piece. Not dramatic. Procedural. Durable. "Then it's begun," he said. Elaine turned to leave, then paused. "This will cost you." James nodded. "It already has." She studied him a moment longer. "It will also define you." James watched her walk away. He did not want definition. He wanted distance. Distance between dignity and negotiation. Susan approached, phone lowered now. "They're asking for a statement." James looked out over the terminal again. A family passed a father lifting a carry-on while his daughter skipped beside him, plastic wings clipped to her jacket. An attendant knelt to adjust the child's lanyard, smiling. The moment was small, ordinary. It mattered more than any headline. "Tell them this," James said. This was never about a seat. It was about what happens when people are told to move without being heard. Susan nodded, fingers already moving. As the morning wore on, the noise grew. Analysts debated. Executives issued carefully worded memos. Commentators argued about intent and optics. James let it wash past him. None of it changed the work ahead. By midday, the airline released its first formal acknowledgement. Not an apology. A commitment. Oversight. Transparency. Reform. The words were measured cautious, but they were there. James read it. Once, then set his phone down. Another plane boarded at the gate where it had all started. Passengers moved through the jet bridge, scanning boarding passes, adjusting straps, settling into routine. No one stopped. No one stared. Seat 2A filled without incident. James felt the tightness in his chest loosen just slightly. Susan rejoined him. "You disappeared from the feeds," good James said. "This doesn't need a face anymore." She smiled. "It already has one." James shook his head. "It needs a mirror." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the aircraft push back, engines coming alive, the massive body moving forward with deliberate grace. James thought of the messages still coming in, the voices no longer quiet, the systems now under scrutiny. None of it would be easy. None of it would be clean, but it would be harder to ignore. He turned to leave, walking away from the window, away from the gate, back into the moving current of the terminal. People brushed past him, unaware of who he was, what he had done, what had shifted, because he stayed seated when it would have been easier to stand. That anonymity felt earned. As he reached the exit, his phone buzzed one last time, a message from an unknown number, short and simple. "Because of you, I spoke." James slipped the phone into his pocket and stepped outside into the light, the noise, the waiting cameras he no longer needed to face. Change did not announce itself. It accumulated. Quietly. Relentlessly. If this story mattered to you, take a moment to like, subscribe, and comment. Stand for dignity.